Okay, so good morning. Welcome to the first official episode of the Home Healer Project. I've already done our kind of intro and, here's what we were thinking, here's why we created this project, but this is the first time we're actually having a guest on. So I've already given Shallon a heads up. This is kind of a rough draft for me, so there might be a lot of editing that happens. But we're really excited to have Shallon Payne with us from the Appalachian Homestead. She just is a wealth of knowledge. So she was the one that I wanted to get on here first for you guys. Just a reminder what the Home Healer Project is about is really connecting us back with those roots and those traditions from those women that we grew up with, our moms, our aunts, our grandmothers, all those people that, this was a normal way of life for them. We took care of our families. We fed them, we healed them, we cared for them in so many different ways. And we've really kind of started to lose so much of that in the last couple of generations. So connecting back with that, Shallon's a great resource for that. So, Shallon, you want to introduce yourself and just kind of tell everybody, what you're about, where you're at, all those kinds of things. You've done so many more of these than I have, so I'm like just taking notes the whole time.
So I'm Shallon from the Appalachian Homestead. I come from generations of herbalism and natural healing. Um, as far back as my family has gone, all of the women have been responsible for everything from midwifing to entire communities to just taking care of their families. And they passed it all down through the generations so that uh, for the long term, they knew their family would be okay.
Perfect, perfect. So, would you agree? That's kind of when people ask where this project came from, I have a really hard time verbalizing it because it kind of snuck up on me. I've always kind of like done my own thing, and I'm not gonna, it's not my place to teach, and I'm so busy doing it, I don't have time to share it, and it just really kind of crept up in the last couple of months where God really started turning my heart towards certain things and laying pieces in place, and I was like, I don't know why this is happening, I don't know why I'm feeling this way, and I'm just going to follow directions. I mean, at this point in my life, I've figured out you're going to follow directions or you're not. And it's a lot easier to just follow directions. So it was as this project developed more and more, I would just like, man, like how I remember the day that it hit, I was like, we used to have that and we don't have that anymore. And to me, that seems really odd with us being in the information age. And we have 50,000 accounts following us on social media and we follow another thousand, all these different things. But I don't feel like the general person is necessarily any the wiser than our grandmothers were. For all this benefit and all this access to information, I don't know that I feel like we know anything more or better or anything like that. And so to me, I was like, man, why are we losing that? Like, why from my grandmother's generation and the women who are like grandmothers to me, are some of our marketing materials has a picture of the woman who was like a grandmother to me more than anybody else, Mrs. Barber. And so I'm interviewing her actual granddaughter at another point. But, what did she, if she were here now, would she know anything any differently because of social media? And I can't say that's accurate. So do you agree? Do you feel like we're kind of losing that in this process and that's becoming the norm? Probably very different for your family. I don't feel like your family's losing that because they have you. But is the general family starting to lose that?
I think that part of the well, for my family specifically, we're pretty insulated in that we're all very close. We live all right together, so it's easy for us to keep those things in the family. But for families in general, I think that part of it is the disconnect of the family as a whole. People live further from their elders. They're not in community with them on the routine, and so they're not hearing or even just learning in the passing by of time and observance the things that maybe their grandmothers were doing because they weren't with their grandmothers. So I do think that that is being lost, and I feel like there's just sometimes there's a lot of really bad information on social media and Google particularly. And I don't think that it's always intentional, the bad information that's out there. Sometimes it's malicious, but for the most part, I think that people learn bits and pieces and it's like a game of telephone.
Mm-hmm.
And so they get this little bit here, and then over here they get another little bit, and then somehow they think those two are related and they put them together. And the next thing you know, they've made an herbal tea blend that they think is a miracle, and they're selling it as a miracle when that particular blend doesn't even make sense to somebody who
Yeah,
actually knows what they're looking at.
yeah, yeah. I've seen that a lot. And it's, from my perspective, my personality is very like, no, this is right, this is wrong, like that works, that doesn't, this is safe, this isn't. And I've really had to learn to just kind of back up and be like, you know what, that's them. If they ask my opinion, that's different. But I would say over the last probably 5 years or so, I've gotten really good at keeping my mouth shut on a lot of things. So it's hugely beneficial, I
It's
think.
so
But it's,
important.
yeah. But then it's like, but what if they do hurt somebody? And I think that's where it gets really tricky for people like us because we actually do care. I don't want you to hurt your family, but I also know that you're listening to 30 other accounts, and who am I in that mix to tell you? So it's kind of like, well, I can either go around chasing down all the misinformation and driving myself and everybody crazy in the process for absolutely no win, or we can say, you know what, let's fix the real root issue. And I think that's really kind of where this whole project came from is what's the problem? Where it's not just, and what really started the whole thing was I don't want to just sell them a good product. I mean, it's, yeah, I think this particular syrup would help tremendously. Like, I have an education in this, and that's why I think it would work well. And we have the evidence that it does, but it doesn't fix the fact that they don't necessarily feel any more confident by giving it. And it's okay, well, how do we change that? And that was really where the project started gelling differently when I was like, that's what we're trying to help. We're trying to make them feel more confident and more educated and more without sending them through an herbal school. Not everybody wants to stop and do that. Not everybody can. But where do we start connecting that in little ways so that it starts to build? And it seems like it's those little steps that make a huge difference. I mean, like your social media, yours is one of two accounts that I follow almost obsessively, and I make sure I watch, like, I don't know if there's a story you've posted that I haven't watched at least in some parts. So it's wonderful to see people like you that actually live this, and there's authenticity to it, and you teach so much. I mean, whether that's through your cookbooks or your Substack or your website, like so much of what you do is all about sharing that information and teaching that to those future generations. So you in part were inspiration for this project. I know that was one of those pieces that just God started pulling all the puzzle pieces together, and then I was like, oh, okay, that's actually making a picture. So that's really really neat to see. But I think you're absolutely right on that. So was it just like your whole family were the home healers, and there's you just had this abundance of people, or were there people that really stuck out to you, and man, this one particular family member or family friend or whatever it was like had such a huge influence on you in particular?
All of the women, um, all the women in my family have been instructed through time. If I had to pick like somebody that I was like, this person was super inspirational to me, my great grandmother, my Aunt Annie, my my great great grandmother, her name was Mary. She was the granny woman, midwife, home trained healer, um, for the entire community. And I don't just mean my family, but the entire coal camp during the pandemic flu of 1918 through 22. And looking back at her, she died before I was born, but my great grandmother lived well into my lifetime. And she would talk to us about it. And my great grandmother's sister passed away of that pandemic flu while she was an adult, but while her mother was healing everyone else and couldn't save her own daughter from it. And one day, I guess it was in the last 3 or 4 years, I was talking to one of my dad's older cousins. My dad's 73, and she was in her late 80s. And she was talking about Mama Mary. And she said, Mama Mary said that she kept a clove of garlic and a pinch of mustard in her lip like a chew.
Hmm.
And that and the grace of God is what she credits for never contracting it herself, even though she was in the sick room with hundreds of patients who were very, very sick and gravely ill, and many who passed away. And that viral load was just through the roof.
Yeah.
And yet she managed to stay healthy through it and was never sick to it at all.
Yeah.
She is a great inspiration to me. And of course, we have family journals that have been passed down, and we have all that information, and that we're writing a book from those family journals right now. As we're talking about this, we've been working on it all morning and have been
Mm.
working on it for weeks now. But she was really inspirational, and reading back through the journals, even more so. Aunt Annie lived until I was in my teen years. She delivered over 1,000 babies at home, took payments of things like pigs and chickens.
Yeah.
Mama, who she lived in well into my lifetime as well. That was Aunt Annie's sister, and just all the women. My grandmother, my mom. My mom is like the guy in the what's that movie? The Greek movie where he puts Windex on everything. My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and he puts Windex on everything. Well, that's my mom with vinegar. It doesn't matter what it is, vinegar is the answer.
Oh, but my mom cleaned my wedding rings for me this weekend with Windex, and I thought of that movie. I was like, "Hey, this works." Oh, funny. Funny. Well, that's an amazing legacy to come from and to continue because following your stories, I see you teaching that to your children and to your grandchildren now, and continuing that on. So that's a huge legacy to have. I think that's so cool to be carrying that on.
It's there for the taking. Um, I have cousins who didn't really have all that much interest in it when we were younger. I was obsessed with my grandparents and all my great aunts, and just I was obsessed with my elders. I was the baby of the family, and they petted me to death, and so I loved to spend time with them, and they just poured into me. And my cousins who weren't as interested, now they'll call me up and they'll be like, I don't know what to do, but I've
Right.
tried everything, and I really don't want to put my kid on this medicine or that medicine or whatever.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what Mama would have done? And so we'll share that with them. And my daughter she's had times where she wasn't as interested. My daughter-in-law, she is more interested now. She didn't come from this kind of thing. And
Mhm.
so she's learning, and she's just like, I want to do everything I possibly can to be as
Mhm.
natural as possible with my grandchildren, the babies. And so what do I do for this, or what do I do for that? The reason that we started sharing it with everybody in the public is because, it used to be one of those things that was kind of like family to family, closely held.
Yeah.
But when we came to social media, and we didn't even come to social media at all, I didn't have one until August the 1st of 2020. And there were so many people who they didn't they just didn't know things. They didn't
Mhm.
know how to grow a garden or herbs, or how to can and preserve their own foods. They didn't know that, all these influencers who had somehow Googled and found fire cider for the very first time, they didn't know that they shouldn't be doing that 2 or 3 times every single day of their lives, and that could lead
Yeah.
to an overhyped immune system and cause big problems
Oh
beyond
my gosh. Yeah.
even the magical illness that was causing the problem then.
Mhm.
Um, so when we started to teach it, the reason we did is because, for one thing, I was worried about the general public, but for the other thing, I thought to myself, this is the day and age where my kids and my daughter-in-law and my grandkids, they're on social media more and more. And it was scary to think that real knowledge might be replaced by some influencers
Yeah.
made up stuff.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to start putting out real information and sharing real remedies that, for the most part, are good for pretty well anybody. And talking about safety, and also knowing that there's a good chance that, kids always have a time where they go away from what they grew up with. And if something were to happen, my house could burn down. We could lose all of the family books. Something could happen to me. They could lose everything that's stored in here. I felt like I needed to cast my bread upon the waters so that after many days it might be found again. in case something were to happen. I mean, that's what we're
Yeah,
supposed to do. So it was born out of genuine concern for other people, but also for the preservation of what could be
right,
lost if something happened.
right. I'm so excited to hear that because in this process of asking people to share those stories of that family, they're sharing part of them. And I wanted to be really respectful of that. And I kept stopping, like pausing and questioning, is this honoring those people and those families and those grandmas and those mimas? Like, is it honoring that? I don't want it to feel like I'm just collecting everybody's stories for my gain. And
Mm.
that's I'm so glad to hear that we're on the same page because it's one thing for me to have an idea, but how I execute it has to match the motives, and that was a really big deal to me. So that's you're answering so much of a really big question in me wanting to make sure that I'm still following directions and I'm still interpreting what I'm supposed to be doing with this project correctly. I feel like if I don't steward it well, it'll be taken away, and I'm so big about I'm very passionate about certain things. And man, if you can catch me on a subject where I'm very passionate about it, and there's this gut, yes, 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 let's do this. This is going to be amazing. Um, I get really excited about those kinds of things, and so being able to share that, I love genealogy since I was a kid. One of the things that one of my aunts gave to me was her mother's genealogy records and books and things like that. So I love continuing that history so that those people are still alive in some part and still caring for their families, even though they've been gone for decades and decades and decades. So I think that's so helpful to have that and to be able to utilize that in this kind of a format because we do listen to podcasts, we do follow Instagram profiles, we do all these things. Okay, well, let's start putting meat back on the bones. I guess maybe that's the kind of the
Right.
way I'm thinking about it. It's I understand there's a million things on Instagram, but I want to be one of those valuable things. I don't want to just be another product account. I don't want to just be another information resource. I mean, that's great, that's good, I like it, but like there's a different passion level with this kind of a project. So that's just to me, it's just hitting so many different things and hitting so many different green lights for me in the process there. So one of my questions was going to be, how are you guys preserving that family legacy? So you had mentioned the journals that you guys keep. I've always been like very anti-journal. I don't want to write anything down. I don't want to just because I always worry that what I'm going to talk about in a journal is going to be so dumb. Like, oh, I watered the garden today. Like, how boring is that? So I tend to kind of minimize my contribution to that. But there's probably there's probably a medium ground and okay, well, let's talk about this that was going on, or let's talk about that. From my perspective, there are a million things I could write about every day based on my clients. You get into territory where it's like, okay, well, I don't know about that because then that seems like an invasion of privacy. So I don't do that. But then I look at papers we have from my great grandpa, and I'm like, he was just writing down his thoughts. And those are so
Yes.
valuable. And you learn so much about that person. At some point, they're not going to know me personally. So,
Right.
maybe that's something I need to revisit. What are your thoughts on, like, how are the ways that you guys hand down and preserve that family memory and intelligence?
So some of it's like very, for instance, like my mom Mary's. Some of it is like chronicling. Her mother passed away when she was giving birth to a younger brother, and it's chronicling that. And then other things are, uh, Cecil was sick and she had this or that illness, and here's what we did for her. I need to write. And sometimes they even wrote, I need to write this down because ain't so and so said to do this and it worked.
Hmm.
So I'm just writing this down here.
Yeah.
And some of it's like literally everybody's like, oh, I bet they're beautiful. I bet some of it's on the margins of Bibles. Some of it's on scraps of paper that they didn't even have a whole notebook, so they stuffed it down in a coffee can. Some of it's in beautiful leather bound journals. But it was just things that along the way they knew that they needed to it's like you making a do you ever write yourself notes to remember things?
Oh my gosh. Post-it. My legacy will be in post-it notes. That bothers me
Right.
a little bit.
The majority of it, they didn't have Post-it notes, of course, but the majority of it is things like that. And then there are some of the people who were keeping journals who it was like daily, here's what I did today. This is what's going on in the world. Almost like they knew that it would be either glossed over, misrepresented,
Hmm.
and they kept, and anytime something important happened, a birth, a death, a major world event, a major national event, a major event in the community, a coal mine explosion or collapse, or, a tragedy, a joy, it didn't matter. It was written about. Um, some in detail, and then other just a note. I have notes from men in my family too. So the women really wrote, and the men more kept ledgers. So, and Mark's family was the same way. And I was just looking, his uncle, who just passed away 2 years ago in his late 90s, he was in the Navy, and he was, I forget what his rank was, but that man kept a ship's log
Hmm.
every day of his life from the time he was in the Navy till the time the man died. And it was like he would write down 0700 called Jane and she said this, like literally kept a Cliff's Notes version of even phone calls.
Wow.
Um, you know, and if it was like my Aunt Helen, Mark's Aunt Helen, she was sick before she passed away and he was taking care of her and he would keep a log of everything. This is the new symptom that she's exhibiting
Hmm.
today. Here's what's going on. Here's what I'm doing for it. This is what mommy told me to do. And, he was 90, so he was talking about his mother who had been way over 100 years old if
Wow.
she were living. And so that's what they're like. And my contributions are more detailed. So what I write down, I keep a log of, and the men did this too. So they kept from seed to harvest, how many seeds they planted, what seed, where they came from, how
Hmm.
much they got out of each plant. I mean, they kept farm ledgers and life ledgers. Mine is almost a mix of that. So I keep a garden journal. I keep the weather every single day.
Hmm.
I keep, I did this or that in the garden and it didn't work the way that it was written down that it would. And then later I might come back and be like, well, that's because this part wasn't written down. And when I told Daddy what I'd done, then he added this second part of information. And when I did that, it worked perfectly.
Hmm.
Um, and the same thing like with herbal things, I'm not above learning new things.
Right.
I lean heavily on the things that have been passed down. But when I learn something new and I see across time that it works, I will write that down and say, I learned this in whatever month of whatever year. This is what was COVID was happening or whatever.
Right.
And here's how we managed that. And this is what worked. Here's something else that somebody said that absolutely did not work and had no, so don't fall into this
Yeah.
trap. It's
Yeah.
almost like a map.
Right.
And theirs are too. Theirs are a little different than what I write down because where we come into this age of technology where there's so many sources of information, you have to keep track of the good information, but you also have to keep track of the things that would be dangerous that are being put out there.
Yeah. Kind of a list of do and do not kind of a thing for sure.
Right, right. And especially like with COVID being a novel illness never seen before. And that was a particular time when, you know, I remember calling Allison, Frog Creek Farms
Hmm.
Apothecarian. And it was during the height of the very, not the height, it was during the freak out of those initial months. And I called her and I said, okay, here's what I'm thinking. And we started talking about artemisinin and we started talking about um, different herbs that would work that we thought would work. And we kind of made a list of things that when we face this, we were going to try them and we were going to see which things worked and which things didn't. And having that extra person to bounce things off of
Right.
was so beneficial. And that's what this community should be for,
Yeah.
then to write it down and to make sure that at least your family, your generations know which things didn't work.
Yeah,
Because there will be another novel respiratory illness for
for
sure.
sure. For sure. It's way too easy. And it was really funny because when COVID hit, I was still in the hospital and had been working on the transition over into natural medicine. So I was seeing both sides of it. And it was funny because my daughter was in eighth grade that year. And the summer before, she had downloaded this game on her phone. And you're creating an illness to take over the world. And it's like this whole zombie thing. And she's like, okay, well, if I give them this, what else can I give them to make that worse? And she's developing this thing. And it's like the flu on steroids, and she's like, what else can I give them? I said, give them lethargy. If they're too tired to get up and there's fatigue, then they're not going to get up, which is going to fail to move the lymphatic system. So their immune system is going to lag. They're going to build more fluid. And so we're talking about this. And then COVID hits, and I looked at her and she said, I didn't do it. like, like a 14-year-old could think of like how to do this. And then this mysteriously happened. So yeah, I'm with you on that. And to think that I probably should have been keeping a journal during that, especially with my perspective being on both sides of medicine. That would have been really neat to do. So maybe that will be what starts me journaling. So I think that's hugely valuable to generations.
I think we learned so much. I I learned so much during COVID. We just learned so much as in from the natural and from the Western medicine perspective of,
Well, and from a societal perspective too, I learned more about people and how they behave
oh my gosh.
during 2020 to 2023. And well, and now that we've had this election, I've learned a whole lot more recently. And it's just like, wow, what are we doing? So,
Well, yeah.
changing it.
Well, so my great grandmother went through the flu pandemic, and then my mom actually had polio. So they went through, I wouldn't call it, I guess that is a pandemic too, but through that epidemic anyway.
Mhm.
And looking back at the journals through those things, I can tell you that the response to 2020 was so much different. People were afraid. They were not, I don't know how it was almost, I think too, it had to do with the society at that time and the most people being people of faith way back. And they seemed to be concerned and to understand the gravity of it, but they didn't freak out
Yeah,
the
yeah,
way that we freaked out with COVID.
right. Which says a
And of course,
lot. I mean, what it says about the strength of the faith at that point, to me that was as alarming as the illness. Like if this is big enough to knock you off of your faith, and you were so big and adamant about, just God's got this, and then something just immediately made you completely forget that God's got this. Like I thought that was a very interesting process to watch. And to me, faith and spiritual aspects are so much a part of health, and you don't hear that so often in conventional medicine side, but you hear it so much more in natural medicine side. But you see it in, look at your family. Like faith is a huge part of
oh
healing and
yeah.
health and how you deal with things. And I think for the Appalachian culture in particular, it's part of what I really want to see develop in this project is us seeing different flavors in this and different cultures and all these different things. And for you guys, the faith healing being so almost, and this is probably the wrong way to say it, but almost like original to the Appalachian culture. There's so many things where it's, reading particular passages from the Bible will stop bleeding. There's things like that. Like, not everybody knows that. Like, those are the things I'm excited to
Right.
share and people to hear in these kinds of podcasts.
So even with herbs, so many people turn it into witchcraft, and historically here it isn't. Um, if my great grandmother or grandmother, anybody in my family would have ever thought that they were doing witchcraft by picking an herb and using it to treat to treat a sick
Right.
person. They would have never picked another herb. They
Yeah.
would have never picked another green thing ever. They probably wouldn't have even grown a garden, let
Well, they
alone
probably would have looked at that person like they were crazy that was saying it in the first place.
right.
So,
Yes.
mhm.
So the combination of faith and herbs, it just intersects. It's they're married.
Yeah.
So and this is not just me, I'm not just speaking for myself, but historically, everybody in my family, at least, and everybody that we have known of similar heritage, looks at it as God gave us food as medicine and every good green thing as medicine. And when we use those the way that He intended, it's part of good stewardship, and it's part also of worship because you're living in the creation the way the Creator intended.
Right.
And so that's a huge part of it. And also, yeah, I'm going to put aloe on your burn, but also I could talk the fire out of a burn.
Mhm. So,
I'm going to go
like
ahead.
that's right where so fill me in more about that. Like if that's something you're interested in sharing, because I think a lot of people don't realize that. And my heritage is Appalachian, but that's very different. Me sitting down here in Texas, generations removed from that area and that culture and that family, than you living it every single day. So this is why, like having you guys that's your real life. Like that's different than me reading about it in a book. So,
Right. Well, in every family, there's somebody who can blow thrush out of a baby's mouth. There's somebody who can talk the fire out of a burn. There's somebody who can, well, everybody can use the blood verse and pray over a bleeding person. And I wish so many times, and Jasmine's been on my social media a lot. She's Paradise Grove Homestead. Um, I wish that she could have been here today because that girl, we were in the hospital and she was quite literally bleeding out. Um, she was very, very sick, bleeding internally. And she was at that point where you're like, okay, we're going to give infusions. And she's terrified. She doesn't want an infusion. And all of a sudden it came to me just like Mama talking in my ear. Why aren't you speaking the blood verse over her? You were taught better than this. And immediately I just started to pray the blood verse, which is Ezekiel 16:6. When I passed by thee and I saw thee polluted in thine own blood, I said unto thee, yea, live. And the verse goes on. But so I started to pray that over her. And only God can stop that kind of bleeding. Only God can raise hemoglobin in 30 minutes time.
yes.
There are things that you cannot explain. And while I would love to take credit for it and be like, yeah, it was because I said that. No, that was because I had a relationship with my Savior. I prayed in earnest. I spoke the word over the sick person, and God heard me and He answered. There's no other way than to that. There was not an herb I could give her, no amount of yarrow that could have been applied to her body or inside her body or anything that would have stopped that. At some
Yeah.
point, you have to go beyond just the physical and into the spiritual. And that's the way that traditionally Appalachians have looked at herbs. And so, even though I might say, do a thyme steam for your sinus or for your cough or whatever for your baby, maybe somebody messaged me about a baby with croup the other night. I didn't just say that and then go on. When I finished talking to that person, I went and prayed
Yeah.
for that baby.
Yeah.
It's as much about that as it is about the actual medicine.
Do you think that's why we are seeing as we progress and as we move down this timeline of the human experience, do you think that's part of why we're seeing almost like a distraction technique happening and trying to get us away from those things that incorporate faith and healing so closely tied together? Because it's almost like we're seeing the enemy distracting us this whole time, and no, here, just take this pill and oh, it's going to make you sadder. Oops. Do you think there's almost like a spiritual battle that goes with that as well, diluting that down and disconnecting us from the family
Oh yeah.
and seeing that in health aspects too? Yeah.
So anything that God has created, Satan is going to counterfeit. So we
Mhm.
were given every green thing as food and medicine. And of course, Satan's going to come along and pervert that, the same as the signs with planning by the signs. And now you have the zodiac that's based on the sun and not the moon.
Mhm.
That's how it works. So every good thing that we have, there's always another thing that's come along to pervert it. And it's so important to be able to discern between the two. So when I'm saying a prayer, I'm not saying an incantation. I'm also never going to use any green thing for evil or to put a spell or a curse or, anything on somebody. Um, it's important to be aware of that, and it is a spiritual battle. It has always been since the beginning of time, since the fall of man. There has been a spiritual battle that is happening in realms unseen that we don't understand.
Mhm.
And it goes for everything, not just for herbs, not just for, blood stopping and all those things. You can take a good thing and turn it evil by taking it as in a prideful way.
Yeah, absolutely. I say that a lot in consults whenever we're talking about things that maybe they're not as familiar with, and I point out like there's God's incapable of creating something bad. It's not in his character. He's not going to compromise himself that way. He won't, and whether he can't or not, he won't, and that's the bottom line of it. Where we get some really twisted things is when we take something God created and turn it into something that in one way or another ends up worshiping ourselves. And I think we saw that so much with
Yes.
the Tower of Babel. Like that was a great thing. And then it started getting weird. And then it started, and I think it always leads back to that original
Yes.
conversation where Satan was offering Eve to be like God. Like if that was the original hook, that hasn't changed at all. So is that where ego changes and it becomes, well, I'm the one who saved them. It wasn't the fact that God intervened and the plant worked the way God made the plant to work. It becomes, well, I saved their life and things like that. So it's an interesting watching that twist and turn that happens in there. So is there a particular, like so many of our listeners are going to be, interested in a lot of that tradition, whether that's recipes and food and herbalism and all those different things. Is there one like quintessential thing that like symbolizes that you would want to share with the listeners? Is there a, hey, there's this particular pickle recipe that just seems to cure coughs in the process, or something like that just
Oh,
kind of sticks out for you?
for me, probably 85% of the time that anybody messages me with the problem, the answer is time. And
Good plan.
if it's not time, it's time as in the herb. If it's
Yeah.
not time, it's garlic or usnea or something. There's
Yeah.
there's a few herbs that will cure almost anything.
Right.
Molasses, we talked about that yesterday.
Yeah.
Um, so time is something that I always have time for. If you have a boogery nose, a wet cough, a
Yeah.
sore throat, uh, thyme tea, a thyme steam.
Yeah.
Thyme steam is magic.
Oh,
So
absolutely. I
many
recommended
times.
that yesterday too. And it was funny because you and I talked right after I'd finished a bunch of my consults for the day, and I had recommended sage and thyme for a sinus issue. I'd recommended molasses for an iron deficiency issue. There were a couple things, and garlic. And I was talking to a group I'm an admin in, and we were talking about garlic and honey, and that being so helpful and so antibacterial and all these things. So it was funny that you said exactly what I'd been talking about that day. Yep, we're on the same page.
I think there are some, I wouldn't say universal because obviously if you have a dry cough, you're not going to use thyme, but most people that I have encountered, especially lately, they have a wet cough and a boogery nose and they're tired of it and they're ready to be better and they've tried everything over the counter. They've tried everything Western and maybe it's a lingering cough because, just because the infection's over doesn't mean all the symptoms go away.
Exactly.
So, thyme steam, man, tie a bundle of fresh thyme to your shower head and turn it on full blast, hot, and point it away from yourself and breathe in that steam, and you will be better within the hour. And you'll have
Hmm.
to repeat it a few times, but your speed of improvement from those wet coughs and those sinus infections and just the yuck in the upper
Yeah,
respiratory system is going to go away like that with a little bit of
absolutely.
time steam. I call it a 25-cent cure because you can, from seed, grow thyme and you can have boxes full of thyme for under
Mhm.
$3. But even if all you had was one or two little seeds, 25 cents worth, you would have enough to cure your family all winter long of almost
Right.
anything they encounter.
Right. Absolutely. So, if there were one thing our listeners started today, because I think, and I can only speak from myself and what I absorb and observe in the process, I tend to, okay, well, it's got to be perfect. And I want the garden bed to be just right. And I'm going to wait and save to buy this. And I delay progress because I'm overthinking it so much. And this podcast was a perfect example this morning. I was starting to get anxious about it because I'm like, oh my gosh. And then it wouldn't log. Oh my gosh. I was like, it's okay. Number one, there's a reason why you're meeting opposition because there's purpose to this. And because if you're called
Right.
to do this project, even if it seems like some silly little project that I'm just really interested personally in, there's a purpose behind it. So of course we would get opposition. That's not surprising. But I will worry myself out of progress in a heartbeat because I was overthinking it the whole time. And it's the okay, I'm not going to worry about did I put makeup on this morning, did I blow dry my hair, it doesn't matter. Like I've really got to, if I'm going to be trying to get people to understand that, I have to embody that first. So I was like, I'm not going to freak out about what I'm going to wear, or if my hair looks a certain way. I'm not going to waste time on those things. But I think even in a bigger application, we see that with progressing in our plans for our homes. I want us to eat food that we grow. I want us to have home cooked meals. I want us to have these remedies available whenever they're needed. And I want those to come from my backyard. So is that a today I'm starting those thyme seeds? Is that what needs to happen? What do you feel like if people listening started one thing today, what do you think the most valuable thing they could do would be?
Well, if you start thyme seeds today, start them inside because it's winter here in North America.
I don't think it
But,
is here. It is 85 already, and it's probably going to be
oh,
in
it's
the
cold here.
90s today.
So if you're in
Yeah.
Texas, go ahead and start your thyme seed. Just throw it out. Thyme thrives on neglect. It does not need to be babysat. It doesn't need any, it needs well-drained soil. That's
Okay.
it. My grandmother, my mom's mother, probably my favorite person when it comes to like planting things. Now, not the garden. She, as far as like herbs and all the other things, not the vegetable garden. That was my daddy's people. I do what they did because my grandmother on my mom's side, she was like the picture of, I don't know, Susie Flower Seed. She just went around just throwing literally, oh, I found this package of thyme seed that I forgot I had, and down it went. The next thing you knew, she had thyme knee high growing everywhere. She had a green thumb. She knew what signs to plant in, but she did not worry whether it was perfect. In fact, her garden was one of the most imperfect herb and flower gardens that I've ever seen, but it was also the most beautiful. I'll have to dig up a picture to show you.
Yeah.
She could make things grow like she had hosta that were the size of a Volkswagen Bug. My mom's the same way. But they just go around throwing out the herb seeds in places that they know the soil's good and that it'll drain enough, but they don't worry about doing it perfectly or putting it in rows or anything like that. They just throw it out. And the next thing you know, I'm like, how did you do that? Because mine failed. And she's
Yeah.
like, I don't know. I just threw it down.
Yeah.
You don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to even be pretty.
Hmm.
Some of,
Yep.
you know, some of the ugliest things can have some of the greatest value.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. That makes sense. It was funny because my husband and I were talking about the garden last night, and I said, I want to change how we do it. The whole time I've been talking about doing this raised bed, and I've done a raised bed, and it didn't do great. Like it did okay. I mean, it didn't die, but I was like, no, we're doing it in ground. And he was like, no, 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 we need to do raised. And I was like, well, Shallon said that you just need to till it and go. I was like, so I'm
Well,
going to go with Shallon's advice. And
especially where you live, because you're in a much hotter, drier climate, those raised beds are you're going to have to babysit them constantly.
yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I don't have that kind of time. If you
Mm,
plant
mm,
something in the ground was designed to hold and to keep life going, and it will. You might have to water it occasionally, but soil that's actually in the ground will hold that moisture much better and for much longer than a raised bed.
yeah.
It just does. Um, but with herbs, if you want to occasionally water some things are going to, more tender herbs like basil and things, you're going to water those once a week. But thyme and sage and woodier herbs where you are, you could throw them on some asphalt and they would probably grow because
I feel like they would.
you
Well,
can't
especially
kill
with the
them.
potholes.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
you just about can't kill them unless you give them too much attention. There are certain
Yeah.
herbs that you just need to forget they exist, and in about six
Yep.
months, go back out there and get you some.
Yep, that sounds about right. I've been obsessing over trying to keep everything alive. Our lighting is different now that we moved into a new house, and I went to my mom's this weekend, and just her whole yard. Granted, she's in Zone 9 in Houston, and I'm in Zone 10 and a half down here in Rockport and Portland area. But everything just grows amazingly there. And she's like, "Well, I just throw it out there," and I'm like, "What? Like that doesn't? I'm loving mine to death, apparently." And it's just I hear that so often. Just let it be. Like check on it, but
You can
don't
do it.
don't water it every day.
If,
So
if I were starting an herb garden today, my herb garden would start with thyme. And if you
mm,
don't want to start from seeds, by all means, go to a nursery or Walmart or Lowe's
yeah.
and buy the plant and bring it home and stick it in some well-drained soil and forget that it exists
Hmm.
because
Yep.
it'll be just fine.
Well, that's what I'm starting today. So I'm gonna get that done because I have time. So time and time. So, well, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. I'm super excited about being able to share your information. We'll be editing and getting it released as soon as possible, I'm sure. But we'll be sharing some of the clips from this interview in our newsletter this week. I'm really excited to get out there. You are exactly what I wanted for this podcast, and just the information you've shared has been incredible. So I appreciate your time and your family and history that all feeds into that. So I'm just really excited to be able to see what you're doing for your family and what we can start doing for ours and probably for our listeners as well. So I
Well, I'm glad
appreciate
that
it.
I'm glad that I got to partake in it. I'm proud of
Yeah,
you.
thank
I
you.
think you're doing
Thank
a
you.
great work.
Well, I'm excited about it. I can't say it was my idea because when I pitched the idea to my husband, he was like, hold on, like you've never wanted to share information like that, like you, a podcast, really? And I'm like, well, actually, the podcast is like additional to the major changes in the whole apothecary. And he's like, okay, let me sit down, like fill me in. So, it was definitely a God led kind of a decision. So I'm excited to see where it goes and what the big picture for it is. So, but we can't do it without you. So I appreciate it. All
Mhm.
right. Well, I will let you get back to your grandbabies and your gardens, and I'll get this edited and put up, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. I'll talk to you later.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.